In the early 19th century, the philosophical establishment operated on a foundation of absolute certainty. Thinkers of the era viewed the universe as a place of perfect order and deep rationality, steadily marching forward in the name of spiritual progress. Arthur Schopenhauer looked at this worldview and rejected it entirely. Schopenhauer's youth was defined by the shipping hubs of Danzig and Hamburg. He was groomed from childhood to take the helm of his father's wealthy international trading firm. His early education took place in the grueling, highly practical world of a commercial apprenticeship. This grounding in the transactional reality of global trade left him suspicious of the flowery academic idealism preached by the era's leading professors. In 1805, his father was found dead in a canal, a suspected suicide. The path for Schopenhauer's life as a merchant collapsed overnight. The tragedy provided an inheritance that granted him absolute, lifelong financial independence. He moved to Weimar, where his mother had established a famous high society literary salon. Schopenhauer felt an immediate, visceral revulsion toward the environment. Surrounded by the frivolous optimism of his mother's social circle, he looked at a world he believed was defined by genuine human suffering. This friction drove him to abandon trade entirely. He utilized his inheritance to become an independent scholar, intent on proving that the rational universe of the establishment was a facade that ignored the grimmer realities of existence. To execute this takedown, he entered the university system, stepping directly onto the home turf of the philosophers he despised. He drew his ammunition from two historical pillars, Immanuel Kant and Plato. He synthesized their work into a radical premise. The human mind does not passively receive objective truth from the outside world. Instead, the mind is an active projector. It forcefully filters and structures reality before the data ever reaches our conscious awareness. The human intellect is a biological survival tool, evolved strictly to present a manageable illusion so the animal can navigate its environment. Schopenhauer set out to prove exactly how this biological projector functions in his 1813 doctoral dissertation. He defined his framework as the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. The first root is causality. The brain forces raw sensory data into a strict chain of cause and effect. The second root is logic. The mind connects abstract premises to conclusions, interlocking thoughts so they make sense to the organism. The third root is space and time. Every object and event is mapped onto mathematical and geometric coordinates. The fourth root is motivation. The brain imposes psychological necessity onto human actions, convincing us that specific motives drive our behaviors. Because our brains biologically enforce these four rules, we are trapped within them. We can never experience true objective reality. We only experience the filtered mirage. He distilled this into his ultimate thesis: the world is my representation. Everything we see and touch is a grand mirage constructed by our cognition. Armed with this thesis, a confident Schopenhauer marched into the University of Berlin. He targeted Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the reigning king of the optimistic establishment. Schopenhauer intentionally scheduled his own lectures at the exact same time as Hegel's. The goal was to steal his rival's audience and discredit his influence. The rivalry represented a direct confrontation between two irreconcilable views: a universe that made sense and a world that was merely a mental construct. Schopenhauer lost. He spoke to an entirely empty room, while Hegel packed the lecture halls down the corridor. Following this humiliation, Schopenhauer abandoned academia forever. He retreated to Frankfurt, settling into a bitter, highly regimented life, accompanied only by his pet poodles. But his work left a terrifying question unresolved. If the physical world is just a mental projection, what is the invisible engine generating that projection? Behind the veil of our rational illusions lies a blind, irrational force. Schopenhauer was about to introduce the world to the will. We experience the world as a stream of images and sensations. Every tree, rock, and person we encounter is filtered through our senses and processed by our minds. We are not interacting with reality directly. We are interacting with our own mental representation of it. We can observe the physical traits of a tree or measure the height of a mountain, but this only provides the outside of things. The inner essence, what these objects are in themselves, independent of our perception, remains out of reach. There is one unique exception to this rule. While every other object is known to us only from the outside, we each possess an immediate, internal awareness of our own physical bodies. Looking outward through the tools of science or detached observation only reveals more representations. To understand what the world is apart from our perception of it, we have to look at the only object we inhabit. We can study our bodies from the outside, treating them strictly as biological machines. A surgeon can examine the tendons in a hand and understand how the muscles react to stimuli, viewing the human frame as just another object in space and time subject to cause and effect. But we also know our bodies through a second, subjective channel. When you move your arm, you don't simply watch a physical object change position. You feel the internal, unmediated urge that moves it. Schopenhauer identifies this internal urge as the will. It is a pre-rational, foundational drive that exists before we form a conscious thought or reasoned plan. In Schopenhauer's view, the physical movement of the body and the internal feeling of the will are not separate events. There is no cause and effect relationship between them. They are the exact same act, viewed from two different perspectives. Because our body is the only object experienced from both the outside and the inside, it provides the template for our understanding of the universe. To know what the rest of the world is in itself, we must apply the one piece of inner knowledge we actually possess. We cannot know anything, we cannot even think of anything, besides will and representation. Since we know our own inner essence is will, and we have no other data to draw from, we interpret the inner nature of every other object in nature on the same analogy. This universal will is not a conscious mind or a benevolent creator. It is a blind, aimless, and relentless impulse. It is an energy that strives forward without any knowledge of its own purpose. We can see this blind force manifesting at every level of nature. It appears in the elective affinities of chemicals, the vegetative drive of a plant toward the sun, and the massive gravitational pull that draws the earth toward the stars. These are all different expressions of the same inner essence. Kant had argued that space and time are the built-in filters of the human mind. Schopenhauer points out that without those filters, there is no way to differentiate one thing from another. Therefore, the reality behind those filters, the will, is a single, unbroken unity. It only appears to shatter into millions of separate objects once our minds apply the principle of individuation. This fragmentation creates a terrifying scenario. A singular, hungry force has been split into countless separate pieces, leaving the will with nothing to feed on but different versions of itself. The natural world is not a state of harmony, but a perpetual war. Because the will is essentially a blind, self-devouring energy, individual manifestations of that will can only maintain their own lives by destroying others. Schopenhauer found a vivid example of this self-devouring nature in the Australian bulldog ant. These insects are driven by an aggressive, mechanical force that persists even after the body is physically destroyed. If you cut a bulldog ant in half, the head and the tail will begin a battle to the death. The two halves will grapple and sting one another until they expire, completely unaware that they are being animated by the exact same will. The violence we see throughout nature is not a mistake or a temporary imbalance. It is the inescapable characteristic of a universe where a single, insatiable will has turned against itself. Our own psychological lives are just a more sophisticated version of this cosmic struggle. Our ambitions and desires are the human manifestations of that same hungry will, driving us to want things we don't have. Schopenhauer's model for human life is a closed circuit. To desire something is to lack it, and to lack something is a form of pain. All willing springs from this initial state of suffering. Fulfillment brings no positive value. It only temporarily erases the painful lack that preceded it. The moment one desire is satisfied, another floods in to take place. If no new desires arrive, the mind is not at peace. It is tormented by boredom. We are caught in a cycle of either wanting what we don't have or enduring the hollow weight of having no goal at all. Because our essence is the will, and the will is a blind, unquenchable energy, suffering is the structural foundation of human existence. Suicide seems like the logical escape from this inescapable cycle, a final act of the will to put an end to its own misery. But Schopenhauer argues that suicide is a tragic mistake. It does not stop the will, it merely destroys the body that manifests it. The person who commits suicide actually loves life. They want the satisfaction and pleasure denied. They are not rejecting the will to live itself, but merely the specific painful conditions of their existence. Shattering the physical body only stops the appearance of life, leaving the underlying reality untouched. Schopenhauer compares it to a single drop of water falling away, while the rainbow remains perfectly intact. The universal will continues its blind striving, unaffected by the destruction of a single vessel. Since we cannot kill the universal will by destroying our bodies, true salvation must look elsewhere. It requires finding a way to silence the will from within while remaining in the world. Every single living thing on this planet is trapped in a brutal, invisible game of endless consumption. Arthur Schopenhauer identified the engine of this struggle as the will, a blind, irrational impulse driving all existence. For humans, this force creates a permanent psychological pendulum. When we lack something, we suffer from desire. When we obtain it, we are paralyzed by boredom. The central challenge of his philosophy is whether we can find a way to stop the pendulum and escape this cycle of suffering. The first reprieve from the will comes through aesthetic contemplation. Immersing yourself in beauty transforms your perspective. You cease to be a hungry, striving individual and become what Schopenhauer called a pure, will-less subject of cognition. This still life illustrates the effect. The artist strips away the decay of individual objects to reveal frozen, eternal tranquility. While all art provides relief, Schopenhauer argued music occupies a category entirely separate from the others. Painting and poetry copy the physical world, but music bypasses it. It acts as a direct copy of the will itself, expressing the raw essence of emotion without the pain. This concept fascinated Richard Wagner, who structured his greatest operas as dialogues with Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Great music provides a blissful Sabbath from the penal servitude of willing, though it remains only a temporary escape. Eventually, the performance ends, and the individual returns to the suffering of daily life. To find a lasting solution, Schopenhauer turned his attention from the gallery to the foundation of human ethics. He argued that true morality is not based on religious commandments or abstract laws, but exclusively on Mitleid or compassion. This compassion relies on the Sanskrit concept tat tvam asi, or thou art that, which recognizes an underlying foundation common to all beings. Compassion pierces the veil of Maya, the illusion that we are separate entities. It reveals that the tormentor and the tormented share the exact same metaphysical substance. Genuine ethics is not a matter of obedience, but an awakening to the fact that everyone's suffering is ultimately our own. If compassion is the realization of the truth, asceticism is the physical action taken to secure final salvation. By adopting voluntary poverty and chastity, the ascetic deliberately starves the life force that drives our continued survival. The goal is the complete denial of the will to live, achieving a state of will-less unity that Schopenhauer associated with the Buddhist concept of nirvana. Schopenhauer himself modeled this isolation, spending his life studying ancient texts like the Upanishad while living in highly regimented solitude. He concluded that the ultimate cure for the disease of existence is to dismantle the very force that makes us want to live. Though Schopenhauer died in 1860, his single thought survived into the 20th century, influencing the very way we understand the human mind. His description of a blind, irrational will dominating a secondary rational intellect became the philosophical template for modern psychology. Sigmund Freud adopted this dynamic to build his theory of the unconscious, transforming the will into the concept of the id. The hidden primal architecture of the mind was successfully mapped by a philosopher the academic world had initially dismissed.
The logic used to map the inner mind eventually intersected with the outer mechanics of the physical universe. Erwin Schrödinger utilized Schopenhauer's synthesis of Eastern monism to conceptualize quantum wave functions and the unified nature of reality. Albert Einstein similarly relied on Schopenhauer's work, specifically his definition of the principium individuanis. This principle defines space and time as a grid that fragments reality into separate, isolated pieces. Einstein used this grid concept to frame his opposition to the strange, non-local connections of quantum entanglement. Despite his reputation as a thoroughgoing pessimist, Schopenhauer did not leave behind a legacy of despair. He spent his final years walking through the streets of Frankfurt, having reconciled his own existence with the harsh truths he documented. His unblinking study of human suffering provided the underlying logic that defines 20th century psychology and the physics of the stars.